I think we all agree that motor vehicle fuels, be they petrol or diesel, are expensive. And the days when there was cheap petrol and cheap diesel and so on are over and done with, and they're never likely to return. So what we want to do, I guess everybody as a driver wants to do, is get the maximum economy from every litre of fuel that they have to put in their vehicle. So what I thought I'd do in this video is try and give you some tips about how to get maximum fuel economy. Bear in mind I'm not a mechanic or an engineer. These are just my own observations. And I should say before I start that motor vehicle fuels, be they diesel, petrol or LPG, in Australia, one of the factors that influences their price is the amount of energy, that is the number of kilojoules of energy released per litre of usage of petrol, or litre of usage of fuel. That's why diesel is the most expensive, because as we all know, you go further on a tank of diesel because it releases more energy per litre. And you go least distance, LPG is the cheapest because LPG releases the least amount of energy in kilojoules per litre, and therefore you travel the shortest distances on LPG. Now this story about fuel economy goes back about 20 years and involves a car. At that time I bought a Ford Falcon, and for those who live outside Australia, a Ford Falcon is a family-sized sedan designed to seat 5 adults, 3.5 litre straight 6 engine, an automatic transmission, and the one I had ran exclusively on LPG, liquefied petroleum gas. And I bought it because at the time I was commuting 200 kilometres per day, and although LPG, you use more LPG than you would petrol for the same trip, LPG at that time was worth about 33 cents a litre and petrol was about 90 cents a litre. So I was paying 1/3 the cost. So I figured that I was probably saving more in money even though I was using more in fuel, because the LPG was much cheaper. So I contacted the Ford Motor Company just after I bought the vehicle and told them what I was doing, and I was travelling 200 kilometres a day on a highway, and I asked them how best to drive the vehicle in order to get maximum fuel economy. And the answer I got was to drive at 100 kilometres an hour and use cruise control. Now I never tested that theory by saying, well, what happens if I drive at more than 100 kilometres an hour, or what happens if I do or don't use cruise control. I just accepted that advice and did that. I kept that car for about 5 years, I think, and I can't tell you the fuel economy because at that stage I didn't take a lot of notice of it. But I did take notice of the idea of driving at 100 kilometres an hour and using cruise control. The next vehicle I had was a motorcycle that didn't have cruise control or a fuel gauge, so I sort of had to estimate things. But the next motorcycle I had was a Kawasaki Vulcan Voyager. That's a 1700 V-twin, and it was a 6-speed transmission, belt drive, and it did have cruise control. And it had also the capacity to show you on the information screen the fuel usage in miles per gallon, which of course wasn't very relevant, or litres per 100 kilometres, which is the standard measure, or kilometres per litre. Now there were times when I was on long highway trips where I would get up to 23, 24, even in 1 or 2 occasions 25 kilometres per litre, and as a routine, once I was on the highway driving, I would get 5 litres or less per 100 kilometres. I had to use 95 rated octane number, or RON as we say in Australia, fuel, because that's what the manufacturer recommended. So I think I got pretty good fuel economy out of that. And I was, when I bought the Spyder, and the first few times I rode it, and I've spoken about this before, I was fairly critical of the fuel economy, thinking it was using a lot more fuel than I thought it ought to do. But as a result of some calculations I did at this service station that you saw at the beginning of this film, I found that wasn't the case. So we'll get to that in a moment, but it's okay. Some tips for fuel economy. Obvious one, I think, is use cruise control. People say, well, my bike doesn't have cruise control, or I want to be in charge, so I don't use the cruise control. As I say, cars these days are very, very much computerised, and I doubt that anyone can drive them as efficiently as the computers can manage them themselves. If your bike doesn't have cruise control, you can get a manual device called a throttle lock, and I'm not recommending any particular brand, but there are several brands, and you can check them out on eBay, or you can check them out at most motorcycle dealers, and you'll find there's a mechanical device that works just like cruise control in that it locks the throttle open at whatever speed you set it at, and sits on top of the front brake lever. So when you pull the front brake in, the cruise control automatically disengages and you have to reset it. So tip number 1, use cruise control. Drive at 100 kilometres an hour where the speed limit is 110. Obviously don't drive at more than a posted speed limit anywhere else, but where the speed limit's 110, drive at 100 and you'll still be able to keep up with the traffic, but you'll save yourself a little bit of fuel. Make your bike as light as it possibly can be. Now obviously you can't physically start taking things off the bike unless of course they're those big heavy hard travel cases that some people have on their bikes. If you're just going on a day trip rather than a long road trip, then you could probably take those things off and leave them behind for the day. If you're not willing to do that, carry only the things in your bike that you need to carry. I would imagine for most people that's wet weather gear. Possibly you carry a spare helmet in case you have a pillion or in case you see someone on the side of the road that you think might need a lift or something. But try to only carry what you need, because obviously the bike's got to move the weight of itself and then move the weight of you on top of that. In the case of the Spyder, for example, it's a 450 kilo bike, 25 litres of fuel on top of that, a few more kilos to account for brake fluid and coolant and other oils and things like that, and then an 80 kilo rider in me. So we're looking at 550 kilos or thereabouts to move. So make the bike as light as it possibly can be. Tip number 3 applies especially at things like this traffic lights, and that is to drive as smoothly as you possibly can. By that I mean, if you're in a situation where there are lots of traffic lights rather than on a freeway, there's a 50% chance that every set of lights you're going to come to is going to turn red. So if lane filtering is allowed where you live and you feel confident to do it, and you get to the top of the rank or top of the queue at the traffic lights, you can drop the clutch and open the throttle and roar away from everybody else as if you're at the start line of the MotoGP. The problem being, of course, that you accelerate very quickly. You have an enormous slurp of fuel out of the tank to accommodate that acceleration, but then if 100 metres up the road there is another set of traffic lights, you've got to decelerate just as quickly, and therefore your fuel usage is uneven. By all means get away from the lights quickly so that other cars behind you can also get away from those lights quickly, but try and do it smoothly, and try and do it so that you are having an even consumption of fuel and maintaining it rather than a surge in acceleration followed by a surge in deceleration. When you're on the highway, as I said, use your cruise control if you have it. If you don't have it, then try to stick to a speed. Don't be, swapping between 90 and 120 or something like that all the time. Try and sit on 100 because, as I said, there's a bit of a fuel saving in there and you're still keeping up with the traffic. Get your bike into top gear as quickly as you can because that's when it's meant to operate at the most fuel efficient. Now, the Kawasaki Voyager that I had a 6th gear, which was a highway overdrive, which I felt contributed very much to fuel efficiency when you're out on the highway. The Suzuki Bergman scooter that I have has a manual override which allows you to access a 6th gear, which again I feel is good for fuel economy. And the Spyders themselves, sometime just after the 2012 models came out, I think about 2014, they not only became a 1330 engine, that they became a 6-speed transmission as well. And I feel the 6th gear would have been very good in terms of fuel economy. So, I guess the basic tips are use cruise control if you have it, where you can. Ride smoothly rather than having massive surges in acceleration. Lighten the load in your bike as much as you can so that you're only carrying what you need and you're not carrying excess weight. And as I say, try and ride smoothly. Now, in some cases, you can do all of those things and you're probably not going to make a great deal of difference to fuel economy, because after all, if you're riding a bike like the Spyder or a Goldwing or a Vulcan Voyager or one of those really big, Harleys or Indians and so on, these are bikes with 1700, 1800 cc engines in the first place, bigger than many small cars these days. And so they're probably going to use a bit of fuel, and so the things that you do that I've suggested might make a small difference to your fuel economy, but every little bit counts. In relation to the Spyder, I was going to explain how I worked out the usage here. I had to ride up to Sydney, as I explained in the previous video, get my bike serviced and ride home, and when I got to the service station that you saw at the start of this video, there were 240 kilometres on the trip meter. I had filled the bike before I left and I reset the trip meter to 0, so I travelled 240 kilometres. I put 16 litres of fuel into the bike at that service station. 16 goes into 240 conveniently 15 and neatly 15 times, which led me to conclude the bike was using about 1 litre of fuel every 15 kilometres. Someone correct me if my maths isn't correct there. Or about 6.01 litres per 100 kilometres, which I thought was much better than the 7.5 to 8 litres per 100 kilometres that I was experiencing earlier. I can say around town that economy would be not as good, but certainly on the open road it was very good. So thank you for watching. Hopefully you've learned some tips for fuel economy, and I'll talk to you again when I'm making the next video.